Welcome to Cheshire Corners. I'm Sebastian Coco, and I'll be your host as we trip through the looking glass. Thanks for coming back to Psychospotlight, our series where we put a spotlight focus on an individual in the psychedelics industry to talk a little bit more about them, their personal life, and what they're doing in the industry. Today we've got Daniel Huson. Huson? Correct me if I'm saying that wrong.
Huson, yeah. It's like Houston without the T.
Huson, Daniel Huson. Houston without the T, perfect. Yeah, Daniel Huson. He's the founder of the Daniel Huson Group, as well as Rose City Labs and Brightbox Labs. And Brightbox is going to be kind of our main focus for today, but thank you so much, Daniel, for coming on. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, man. So before we talk about Brightbox more in depth, I want to talk more about you. I did a little bit of cursory research of my own, and I want to talk about how a mechanic for Boeing, a career mechanic for 23 years, ends up opening one of the first medicinal cannabis dispensaries in Oregon. Like, that's super crazy and fascinating to me, especially because that was your stepping stone to Rose City and Brightbox, from what I'm kind of able to tell, these testing companies that really focus on recreational drugs and environmental standards. But before we get to that, can you tell me more about your personal history and just kind of how you go from mechanic to entrepreneur?
Yeah, so basically I started in the aircraft industry at 13 years old, working on them and flying them, and I ended up starting my first business then, doing letterheads and business cards for pilots so I could fly. Anyway, long story short, the only thing I've done just about equally as long is use the cannabis. I was introduced to it at an early age, and I've consumed cannabis my whole life. Then in 2014, I actually ended up sick with cancer in my spinal column, and I ended up deciding at that point, well, instead of playing the in the shadows with cannabis, I was going to go ahead and go legal. So I got my medical marijuana card, 2014. Went through a bunch of treatments and stuff, and I started helping other people also that were struggling from everything from cancers to seizures to all of that stuff. So basically, in 2011, by the time I was growing for 19 people while working at Boeing, I decided that I couldn't do that. I couldn't continue to grow and grow for more people medically. And I was so passionate at that time about natural medicines and how it's helping more than the Western medicines are. And so I decided to, at that point, find some people that were willing to possibly go to jail with me, and we decided to open up a dispensary. And at the same time I opened the dispensary in 2011, I actually did open up Rose City Laboratories in 2011, but I didn't form a company until 2012. And that had to do with just trying to navigate the legal systems and trying to make sure that, that the one investor that I did have was protected, and that his equipment or investment was protected. So at that point, so my investor was actually one of my patients' father that was wanted to invest in me because they saw what I had done with helping their daughter out. So at that point, we opened it up, and in 2012, they came to shut me down, the district attorney and the cops and everybody, and I actually made the paper. It was a little news article called Cracks in Oregon Law Filled with Weed. And it talked about how it was quasi-legal and they had worse stuff to worry about and all that other good stuff. It's kind of a cool little article. It talks about Mount Hood Wellness Center. That was my dispensary. So then, by the time we rolled around in 2018, I added a bunch of environmental testing, and now we have the only cannabis company that I know that has federal government contracts, state contracts, and all of that good stuff.
Wow, that's an amazing journey. Yeah, thank you so much for because that's, that's pioneering, as far as those are the steps that, or those were the shoulders that Coloradans built on and opening up their own dispensaries and kind of getting to the point where we are today. So I appreciate all the work that you've done kind of in helping mobilize the forces personally.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course, man. So we had Bjorn on the show last time, who is the senior chemist for Rose City Labs, and we just mentioned them. You started them in 2011, had that little altercation, and then went public in 2012. That's all in Portland, in Oregon, where you own and operate Rose City Labs. So can you tell me more about your relationship with Bjorn? And then you were talking to me about you started it at the same time as the dispensary, but can you tell me a little bit more of why you started Rose City Labs in the first place?
It was my real main reason, the number one reason, was so I didn't get arrested. Honestly, opening a dispensary, I figured, how could I open a dispensary and sell product to consumers without being arrested? And I figured if I tested the product for potency and purity, pesticides, that would be a leg up. And I think that was really part of it. But I'm also just a natural forager, and I love hunting for stuff through the woods, and then I find stuff and I always want to know what is in it, how strong is it, and so on and so forth. So that's another reason. I just love science.
That's awesome. So the foraging for stuff in the woods, I know that Oregon is one of the few states in the union where psychedelic mushrooms will grow. So would you actually forage mushrooms and then go from there, figure out how to test the psilocybin content? Is that kind of what I'm reading out of that, or correct me if I'm wrong here?
Yes, that's how I kind of started getting up and running in the psilocybin industry. And then in 2020, when we passed the law here in Oregon for the psilocybin therapy, we really hunkered down and spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in research and development, making sure we have dedicated equipment and validated methods, and then we turn around and submitted all that data to the state. But that's kind of, it's to find out what is in the mushrooms, because they're constantly finding now mushrooms still today that they haven't really identified, but yet is testing positive for psilocybin. So there's thousands and thousands of mushrooms still out there, I think, yet to be found.
No, I totally agree. I think we had because I did a video called The Brief History, or it was in The Brief History of Psychedelics and What Are Magic Mushrooms, where I believe there are 150 psilocybe species currently known, and then it's something like 200, about 200 total magic mushroom species. So I totally agree with you, considering there are literally tens of thousands. I believe the estimate that I found in my research was 50 to 100,000 species of individual mushroom on the planet, based on projections from analytical studies and that kind of thing. But considering those margins, there's no way that only that small tiny percentage is psilocybin bearing. So I totally agree with you, and I'd be super interested to see the new generations of explorers almost going out to try to find the next big mushroom. It's an interesting paradigm to kind of think about.
Yeah, people like Paul Stamets found azarescence, and so he kind of labeled that one. And you won't be able to really find these, because us as humans, we've kind of been programmed over the years that don't eat mushrooms are bad, they're poisonous, and it's there are poisonous ones out there, but there's a whole lot more edible ones out there too. And we just have to be smart about it. And with the research now, so it's not only psilocybin and psilocin content, but we also know that baeocystin and some of these other minor tryptamines actually really affect the person. We found, or we've heard that there's mushrooms out there without any psilocybin with all baeocystin, and it's really just about the same effect.
That's interesting. I was seeing baeocystin come up in my research for specifically that episode, What Are Magic Mushrooms, which was just a summary. And for your context, I was actually in college going to get my PhD in neuroscience for a while, so I've have a pretty extensive background in chemistry, psychology, neuroscience, like type of research. So I was doing a lot for that, and I saw a lot on baeocystine. So I think it's very interesting that is, because I was actually really I was wondering, I was going to ask you, because there's all of this focus right now on psilocybin and psilocin, of course, which they go hand in hand, obviously. But and you kind of answered it, beyond baeocystine, and obviously there's muscimol and amanita and all that kind of stuff, but what other plant alkalines do you see as being important, and how can we go beyond, I guess, how can we categorize a trip just beyond psilocybin content? Because there's a lot of different plant alkalines that have a different effect on the person. So I guess you're really deep in that and in the minutia of that. So I'd love to know your opinion on that.
Yeah, there's a couple other tryptamines, norbaeocystine, psilocin, and there's another one that starts with an A, and a couple others. But basically, we're just still starting to find out and starting to be able to measure and quantify the compounds themselves inside the mushrooms. But when it comes down to understanding the effects of them, I think it's going to really truly take somebody that has extensive experience with psychedelics, especially the mushrooms, and they try the different species with the different numbers and try to rate their experience that they have with that. Whether it's quicker onset, whether it's more vivid colors, or whether it's more hallucinations or whatever. I think that's where it really comes down to, is somebody with a little bit of experience in that, ingesting them to be able to help us understand. Somebody just new, fresh off the gate, never consumed mushrooms, they consume it, and it has different numbers for different stuff. There's really no baseline for them to understand where they started or what they should expect or what these numbers will do to them. So yeah.
No, I totally agree. And honestly, that was, we around here are starting a series called Shroom Studies, where we'll have side by side a mycologist, Kyle Obenberger, over at Full Canopy. He'll be talking about a specific strain of, starting with cubes, of course, and just talking about kind of some of the growth factors, some of the things that he's noticed as, X, Y, Z, these are different trips and all that kind of stuff. And we'll kind of smash that together with a film of me taking that mushroom. We'll try to do it at a consistent dose. Obviously, it's a little challenging because, if we get into Enigma, Pan-Cyan, we can't take the same. It'll get weird if I take the same dose for a much lower percentage penis envy or something like that. But that kind of thing is absolutely one of the goals we're trying to accomplish with the series, of just getting a good feel for these different strains of mushrooms, because we have geneticists going crazy with the breeding, like in the last 5 years especially, and we don't know exactly what they're breeding yet. I mean, that's obviously that's the human way of, breed the food first, eat it, and then we'll find out a little bit more about it in the future. But it's really cool to be in a time and place where the cultivation, the genetics is so closely married with the analysis, especially as far as time goes. I think it's going to give us a real leg up in all that.
I agree, 100%.
Let's talk about you and Bjorn.
Yeah.
Tell me more about how you guys got started and how, because he seems like a really integral part of Rose City. So how'd you find him? How'd you place him there?
Well, early on, when I was trying to open up multiple dispensaries and do multiple laboratory locations or whatever in Portland, which I learned that, you really only need one lab, but when we moved him, that was a different story. But anyway, I put an ad out for a more of an IT guy, because in the cannabis world, there's a lot of regulations and security and all of that. So I was hiring an IT guy, and he had a bunch of experience with Yahoo, I think it was, and some other companies, but I snatched him up, and because he did also have some chemistry background. And then he just ended up working as a lab technician for me for a while after he did the IT stuff. And then at that point, he felt like he wanted to spread his wings and see how the grass was on the other side. So he actually went to 2 or 3 of my competitors and worked there. And then after he did all that, then he kept trying to come back over to where I was and come back, because we really have good science. We got good equipment, and I come from an aircraft background, so I've kind of implemented that in my laboratory. And so basically he came back, and we just started working together because in my opinion, he's a genius. And we just started creating and validating methods, and then we submitted it to the state accreditation company and got accredited.
In our episode, we talked a lot more about the protocols themselves, kind of how he came up with them, how you guys came up with them. So it's cool to hear that you were also like a really integral part of that whole process, which makes sense. But there's a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of business owners who will be a little more hands-off and be a little more, I just want to get involved because I'm interested kind of thing. So I respect the boots on the ground work for sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, I started the laboratory in my basement, and I went and bought a GC, and I used it myself. So, I mean, it's kind of, I feel like I kind of do need to know the operations of my own company. It's kind of cool.
No, I'm of the same opinion that like if you can be more integrated with your staff, it's a lot easier. Okay, cool. So let's bring it back to the present, from your relationship with Bjorn to your relationship with Brightbox Labs. So can you tell me a little bit more, because from what I saw, like the cursory research I did, it's looking like you're kind of trying to divide your testing guidelines of Rose City is more focused on recreational drugs, psilocybin, all that kind of world. And then Brightbox is focusing more on environmental standards and then kind of more cutting edge R&D. So can you tell me a little bit more about how you're dividing up those organizations, what those functions are? And then also, after over a decade in Portland, can you tell me why you decided to open up a new location in Bend? I think that was really interesting, especially because my best friend from college grew up in Portland, so I'm sure he'd have a lot of strong feelings about like Portland, Bend, the whole thing.
Yeah, Portland and Bend are definitely different parts of the state, and everybody in the different sections are definitely different. Now, I have been ready to expand my laboratory for a long time, just waiting for the right opportunities and the right moment, and making sure that I'm making the right moves. So what happened was last year, the end of last year, one of my cannabis testing competitors was going out of business in Bend, Oregon, and we started getting calls. So I called the owner of the lab, and I said, hey, quit telling everybody you're going out of business. I want to buy you. And I made him an offer. He accepted. I walked in and took it over in 3 days and started operating it.
Awesome.
So then we turned around and changed the name of it and relocated the location of it. And at that point, we ended up adding environmental testing, the water quality and stuff like that now. So that's kind of where I was and why I moved over here. I really wanted environmental laboratories all over the whole country. Actually, it's really important. I think that most of us as people, we take it for granted that the city is supplying us safe drinking water, and they're not, and it's actually contaminated, and other things we rely on. And it's like, once we opened up, or once I started doing all this R&D testing and stuff, it's like, oh my gosh, there's so much out there, and it's crazy. So basically that's how that all started. Now, Rose City in Portland is definitely deals with all the licensing and all the entities that I have to deal with for the psilocybin industry, the magic mushrooms, and the cannabis industry and the environmental industry. Now, basically, the psilocybin is all run through the Oregon Health Authority. The cannabis is all run through the Oregon Liquor Control Cannabis Commission. And the environmental is also kind of run through the Oregon Health Authority. So that's kind of how it does it. And then over here in Bend, we have the luxury of being able to do a little bit more R&D testing for the non-licensed industries or unregulated industries. And so that's kind of just to keep it separate so the regulators don't question me over at the one laboratory.
Sure, yeah.
So next, I'm actually hoping to open up in Denver, Colorado, and I would love to go ahead and open up in Oakland, California, or somewhere in that area also. For psychedelics testing, not just psilocybin, but also the MDMA, the ecstasy, or everything, DMTs, whatever the industries are going to eventually go towards.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That would be really, really, really cool. And I totally agree with you that not only is environmental testing in different localities for that region super necessary to actually make it work, but having more recreational drug testing across the country is one of those things that will destigmatize and kind of show, hey, this is what's actually at work. These are the chemicals that are actually making the change. For me, it's very similar to, in college, I took a class that was on kind of nuclear energy and kind of matching the actual building of reactors to locations and regions around the world in order to prevent climate crisis, because that's the real issue with nuclear energy, is if things shut down and how to get rid of the waste. So it was very interesting to hear you kind of saying the same thing, at least a little bit about environmental testing. Can you speak a little bit more into how, I think for the recreational drugs, it's going to be a little bit more straightforward, but can you talk a little bit more about how the environmental testing really should vary from region to region, and even kind of what you've seen between Portland and Bend?
Yeah, definitely. Different sections or different regions of the state so far are having different water quality problems. Over here in Bend, they have a lot of nitrates and stuff like that. Over in Portland, it's a lot of problems with lead. Up in Vancouver, they actually just announced beginning of this year that all the people in Vancouver, Washington, all have unacceptable levels of PFAS in the water. PFAS is a forever chemical, and we're actually starting to onboard that testing protocol and hope to be up and running by January of next year. But it's a little bit crazy. And then there's sections of Portland that are really high with radon, the radon gas that comes up from the earth. Wow. And then there's other sections that are not, and it's really interesting to understand that all these different factors, and it makes me now when I want to move, because I am actually wanting to move and find a bigger piece of property, but I'm actually concerned about the radon maps now and where the radon's coming up and this or that, because I don't want to buy in a place that's gonna give me cancer and kill me. So.
No, that's totally valid. That's totally valid. I guess as I was hearing you say that, and as I was thinking about it, I want to go back on my statement about the psilocybin testing, because different grows happen in different climates, in different substrate, all that kind of stuff. So do you see any sort of fine tuning in the future for your testing process based on the different substrate or region that these mushrooms might be grown in?
So when it comes to the testing is universal. It doesn't really matter what region. It comes to the growers at that point, what region they're in and what materials they're using. And definitely some people in certain sections of the country may be using a certain rye because it's everywhere and it's all in the fields. But then another area of the country may be using a different type of berry or something to be able to use for their substrates. People are starting to really focus on their substrates and figure out what substrates are going to be able to help produce more vigorous growth and more potent mushrooms. Now, a lot of it also comes down to when you're doing the mushrooms, you do want to have some sort of climate controlled conditions. So hopefully you have less environmental, but when you are watering them or doing stuff with water, you do want to make sure your water is clean and safe, and not just your substrate. Substrates are probably going to be clean and safe, but the water is not. And so, example, cannabis. Right now, a lot of people are failing in the cannabis world for their outdoor grows because of the water they're watering it with, and the soil that it's growing in are both contaminated. So you can have clean substrate and water it with dirty water. So that's actually another reason I really felt like it was important to expand into the environmental testing, is because growers, they really should be able to test their substrates and or soils and or water and or in their building. We had a lot of people that were failing for pesticides in the cannabis world because of the building they were in. Somebody before had sprayed the bombs and stuff, or done different things, and it's in the ventilations and it's all that. And I try to be the one-stop lab that nobody ever needs to go anywhere other than me. I could test your environment, I could test your water, your substrate, your anything. So yeah. And we find it also helps a little bit with consistency too in all the industries, because if you know what you're starting with, even with your water or whatever, then you know what you're going to hopefully finish with.
No, definitely. I mean, it's very parallel to the microplastic effect of it's a lot of little things in a bunch of different areas for the grow that ultimately end up in contaminants for the end product. So it's really interesting to see kind of the parallels in that, and kind of just my girlfriend is actually, she's a law student going into environmental law. So it's one of those things that it's sad to talk about, but I'm always talking about, and I recognize the importance of it. But yeah, it's really interesting to hear kind of that side of things, the contaminant side of things, as far as the cannabis world, because I think that is a really good microcosm for just how a lot of pollution practices have kind of ravaged our world, which really sucks. But yeah, so you talked a little bit about having labs across the country, about how every state, every different region should have an environmental lab kind of thing. Can you tell me next steps for you personally, kind of in this entrepreneurial world of testing, but also in kind of what you see as the most productive next steps for specifically the psychedelic industry, when it comes to whether that is, looking at specifically psilocybin and psilocin percentages, bringing in more plant alkalines, trying to do more research on X, Y, and Z, whatever your opinion is on what the next steps are. That's what I want to hear.
Yeah, so my entrepreneurial spirits, basically I'm just trying to continue down, adding more laboratories. Eventually one day I'll get big enough, somebody will want to buy me, and then I can go on to my next little venture, which is going to sound weird, but I created a really kick-ass vinegar, and nobody else really has, and I don't know, I want to do something with my vinegar. But anyway, it's in the psilocybin industry, I think it's really amazing where we are. In all the research and development testing we're doing over at Brightbox, we see the fact that there's large amounts of people being real creative with their packaging, really creative with the way that QR codes and NFT deals are happening, and just all kinds of different stuff. I think that the more we create, kind of like we did with the cannabis world, apps and stuff where it tracks and keeps track of and record of different terpene contents and different, not just terpenes, but different tryptamines and different other things in the psilocybin that will allow it to just keep recording data, I guess, is where I'm at. Just keep collecting data, and I think with all the AI tools and everything we have, it'll help us be able to spread the word and knowledge and all of that. I guess that's about it, I think.
No, I totally agree. And we actually, to kick off the series, we had Dr. Erica Zelfand, who's somewhat big in Oregon. I'm not sure if you've heard of her or not before. She does a lot of facilitator training, but she talked to me a little bit about how there was some public resistance with part of what Oregon is doing with psilocybin is collecting all of the data from healing centers. I believe also grows and testing facilities as well. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that one. I know for a fact healing centers. And I'm personally am very pro that, because we had a research like kibosh for 50 years. No one was able to touch this stuff legally. Like, we have a lot of lost time to make up for, especially considering in that time period, you know, a phone went from something that could only be on the wall of your house to something everyone has in their pocket. So like, we're talking about a huge period of technological advancement that we need as much data as possible to catch up with.
Yes, and there is a bunch of resistance with people and their data being collected for the psilocybin program. And I've tried to come up with ways with some of these treatment centers that they can approach it in a better fashion. And I've kind of recommended that maybe they call it a pass it forward program, and that they could sign up to give out certain data, you know, and it's just pass it forward. You know, if you experience something, pass it forward so the next person can experience it and enjoy it. I really think it's just key that we continue to work together and communicate, I guess. Yeah.
No, man, I totally agree. I mean, that's the same kind of thing that we're trying to promote around here. Just open communication. Let's let the data flow as much as possible. And at the end of the day, we're talking about mushrooms. You know, like, this isn't some demonized, vilified, like a lot of people try to make it out to be, and kind of, you know, the historical approach by the DEA and a lot of other governmental authorities as far as how to just keep the public away from these substances. They're just mushrooms. They grow out of the earth, you know? They are here, whether we like it or not. So I think you're totally right. Just staying active, staying communicative, and making sure that we're all sharing information and staying on the same team. That's gonna be the big thing that keeps us going forward.
I'm just really excited that as more tryptamines or alkaloids or whatever come on board, that we're able to bring them on board and quantify and test them. And that's really the exciting thing is the new undiscovered stuff. You know, when cannabis started, we really only talked about THC and CBDs. And now, what do we talk about? Delta 8s, Delta 9s, and all these other stuff. And yeah, same thing. It's pretty exciting. I'm excited to be in this industry. And you mentioned muscimol earlier, amanitas. We actually do testing for amanita all the time, and we run that across what we call a mass spectrometer, multiple mass spectrometer, liquid chromatograph machine. And diabonic acid is what's bad in that for people. So if you can pick the amanitas and process it and get rid of the diabonic acid, then you're good to go. You have a mushroom that has a more euphoric effect.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. And I think that right there is the kind of thought and the kind of, I mean, obviously we need policy to catch up a little bit first, because we're like at a fine line. We're not quite there yet, but I think people will look back at conversations like this in 5 to 10 years and be like, oh, this was like absolutely what we needed to talk about. This is the direction we need to go. And different alkaloids, actually looking at the, you know, striating what's in the mushroom. And I think that it's going to make an almost more noticeable impact for psychedelics because of the very particular and specific effect that psychedelics have for each individual person. They're more fine-tuned than cannabis in a lot of ways, in my opinion. And then you get into the debate of psychedelic cannabis and kind of how you can fine-tune use cannabis. So that's an episode, a thing in and of itself. But I do think that fine-tuning that these substances is going to, because let's face it, like only the most dedicated stoners are kind of caring about terpenes and the different deltas and, you know, like when, especially when they're just grabbing flower off the shelf kind of thing. So I think it'll be more important for traditional classic psychedelics like mushrooms. And I think that that's gonna have a huge impact on kind of where the future goes.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
No, I totally agree, Daniel. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. We've loved having you. For our viewers, make sure to check out Rose City Labs and Brightbox Labs. If you have any testing needs, they can handle it all. And everyone, make sure to keep an eye out for Dan's vinegar. Clearly big things to come with that.
That's funny, thanks.
Of course, Dan, thank you so much for coming on the show. We really appreciate
All right,
it.
thank you.
Of course, to all our viewers at home, if you enjoyed, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It is huge for us. And of course, as always, don't get psyched out.
Cool.